At the time I was born, near the end of the First World War, my mother was living with my grandparents. They lived in Stuttgart and they came into this world kicking and screaming like most babies, but in the middle of an air raid. My father, Wilhelm, was away serving in the First World War at the time of my birth. He, along with his two brothers, had quite a hard upbringing, being born into a poor farming family. His father died when he was young, and later, when his mother remarried, father's half-brother was born. Father was very good at school and was sent to Stuttgart to a kind of orphanage school, where he worked well under the strict discipline. Later, he qualified as a teacher and, prior to the First World War, he taught at several small schools in outlying villages around Stuttgart. Somewhere during his teaching, he met my mother, and they married. At the beginning of the First War, he was conscripted into the Imperial Army and served as a lieutenant in an infantry regiment. He served on the French, Italian and Romanian fronts, and whilst in Italy his company commander was Erwin Rommel. I distinctly remember this because during my time at the Luftkriegsschule, Rommel was teaching tactics at the neighboring army officer school at Potsdam. My father and I talked about him a lot. Father was obviously impressed by the ingenuity of Rommel in the First World War. After the war, we moved our family home to Ochsenwang, a small village nestling on the shoulder of the Schwäbische Alb, about 40 kilometers from Stuttgart and 800 meters above sea level. We lived there from 1918 to 1925, and at that time there was no electricity and no piped water. My father was the teacher at the school, and part of the remunerations for this post was that he had accommodations provided. The family occupied the top floor of a house which had the distinction of having once been the home of the German poet Eduard Mörike. The small church, where he had been the vicar for the year 1832 to 1833, was opposite the house. Our family was quite poor at this time, but despite this, I remember that I had a very good time as a young boy. To give some idea of the meagerness of our resources, it was some 2 or 3 years before my parents could even afford a simple bicycle. This lack of transport produced some problems because there was only one small shop in Ochsenwang which stocked a few items such as sugar. Any other shopping was done by my father in Kirchheim unter Teck, involving a 12-kilometer walk in each direction, or sometimes at Weilheim, which was only 9 kilometers. It is strange how the memory selectively retains some things, but rejects so many others. I imagine that it is perhaps proportional to the emotion of the trauma which was involved with the event. I know that one of my strongest early memories surrounded a Christmas which was not to be one of my happiest. Father had set off to Weilheim to make the final purchase for Christmas. As was custom, I was allowed to walk down through a narrow valley called the Zipfelbachtal and wait for him at Hepsisau. After what seemed to be an age, he was back, and we began to climb back up to our home. As we negotiated a steep hill beside a frozen stream, father slipped on some ice and fell into the steep valley, his fall only being arrested by some small pine trees. He wasn't badly hurt, and no bones were broken, but inside his rucksack could be heard the sound of broken glass. He had made a special purchase of 2 new glass cylinders for our oil lamp at home. We only had one lamp, but he had thought to buy a spare just in case of an accident. Now, both were broken beyond repair. The result was that nobody could read after darkness had come, and the cheerful music of my mother's piano playing and the joy of Christmas carols in the evening was replaced by the exchange of none too amiable words. Although this is a personal family story, there is, I feel, some social comment in it. At the age of 4, I was allowed to roam far and wide without fear of molestation. When my father went to Kirchheim unter Teck, which was on the other side of the hills to Weilheim, I could walk about 4 kilometers to wait for him by an old lime tree. Sometimes I would sit patiently for 2 or 3 hours before I could make out his figure in the distance. What caring parent would allow a child of any age to range so freely these days? The world has become a very hostile environment for these innocents. It is difficult now, I think, for people, particularly young people, to imagine with any degree of accuracy how comparatively primitive the conditions were in those days. Take, for example, a simple food item like bread, now available in any food shop and with many varieties being stocked in the larger stores. Firstly, in my childhood days, milled flour was very expensive. So after the harvest, we would ask the permission of the farmers to go gleaning in their fields. We would pick up the ears of corn and wheat which were left, and even the individual grains. This raw material could then be ground into coarse flour for baking the bread and sometimes cake for the family. The baking itself wasn't undertaken in the home because we didn't have the luxury of an individual oven in the kitchen. None of these small houses in the village did. Instead, there was a communal baking house beside the school used by most of the population, and it was a treat for us to be taken along for the evening baking session. Not only was there the possibility of newly baked bread or cake to eat and other children to play with, but also there was always news and stories to be heard. This is another area where there has been huge progress in my lifetime: communication. Just 65 years ago in Ochsenwang, we were cut off for most of the winter, and even in the bloom of the summer, we didn't have regular newspaper, and the radio was still in its infancy. Some radio ham operators did operate cute crystal sets, but the reception was poor and temperamental. So, it was important to listen to the stories which were being told, and the bakehouse was a good venue for this. Another source of the news and of impressions of the outside world were the shepherds and the stonecutters. My friends and I wandered many kilometers away from home without fear or any anxiety. We spent many attentive hours listening to the shepherds and watching them as they brought the young lambs into the world. Similarly, the stonecutters working the small roads were great raconteurs, some of them having traveled widely. In 1925, we moved to Creglingen on the Tauber River. Creglingen is about 80 kilometers northeast of Stuttgart, between the historic town of Rothenburg and Bad Mergentheim. Father had applied for a job as a teacher at a fairly large school and was to be appointed as deputy to the director. There were 4 elementary grades and then 3 high school classes, with each of the lower classes having 2 levels of teaching within them. It was a very traumatic time for me. I was looking forward to moving to a town and into a larger school, but I had led a protected life in many ways in the village, and the shadows of the town seemed, to a 7-year-old, to hold many fears, not least of which was the problem of communication with other children. Although we were only moving about 200 kilometers, the dialectal change was quite severe. We in the country spoke the strong Swabian farmers' language, but in Creglingen we had to get used to Franconian. It wasn't just a question of accent, but of a very different language. Again, I have to comment that today it must be difficult to accept these differences because the medium of radio and television has done much to eradicate the strong dialects and turn them more into accents. To young children, however, it was a major problem to overcome. I suffered much ridicule about being a farmer or a hayseed, children being the particular cruel animals they are. My parents were labeled as social climbers by some of the established townspeople. After all, they had come to Creglingen from a very small mountain village and then begun to carve a place for themselves within the community. My father had been very active in improving the football field and training the teams. Soon they were regularly winning matches against other towns, and his notoriety began to grow. Not only was he responsible for the equipment and the managing of the team, but also for the preparation and maintenance of the field. As his energy and personal ambition led to the improvement of the field, he realized that, being close to the Tauber River and in a small valley, a natural grandstand was provided for spectators, and the games began to attract substantial audiences. Soon, in addition to the well-supported football, he introduced athletic events like long jump, high jump, and shot putting. All of this was good for the community as a whole, but proportionally raised the ire of father's self-declared enemies. Mother, of course, was not to be left out of this, and soon began her own inroads into the social side of the football club. First, she began a class of gymnastics for the women and presented a new show for the Christmas celebrations. Tradition had it that there would be presentations, some extracts from the theater, and speeches. Mother's gymnasts class performing to music was quite new and innovative. It was also a great success. Then she began to form a mixed choir, and this too was soon fully subscribed. Their successes were both a blessing and a curse. Their kind of talent, energy, and organizational skill almost always makes enemy amongst those who lack some or all of those qualities. Within the town there was a sporting organization known as the Turnerbund. This was attended by the higher class people of Creglingen, such as the mayor, the Bürgermeister, the doctors, the dentist, and the chairman of the Reichsforstamt. They found the success of the lower class club to be an embarrassment, and when Mother's choir won a competition against the choir which was coached by the wife of the director of the Reichsforstamt, Frau Henning, what had been mere chagrin became a positive affront. All these problems passed over my head at the time and didn't affect my life too much. However, the future would change this dramatically. But for the meantime, I busied myself with my very full life. For years, it had been a joke in our family that I was forever fixing or dismantling things, particularly machinery. My sister reminds me that I was always to be seen as a young boy with a small hammer and a saw in my hands. This interest in things mechanical persisted, and in Creglingen I befriended the owner of the first small garage. At first I helped out by cleaning cars or motorcycles and would be rewarded with a few pfennigs or a ride on a motorcycle. After a while I began to help with the removal and stripping down of motorcycle engines. Very soon the mechanics began to trust me more, and I graduated to grinding in the valves of the cylinder blocks. At this time most engines were side valves with the ports located in the cylinder blocks. Later they were to be located in the cylinder heads. I enjoyed the work and was often to be seen on the back of a speeding motorcycle or in one of these still very rare cars. Herr Unger, the owner of the largest store in town, once, when discovering that I had cleaned his car several times, took me for a ride in his NSU car the full 50 kilometers to Künzelsau. He was very proud that we only had to stop twice to repair the tires. The problems which had been created by my parents' success were soon to be vested upon me. It is sad to remember that the adults who were involved didn't have the courage to challenge my parents directly. I wasn't aware of what was happening at first, but soon I began to bear the brunt of all sorts of unreasonable attacks by senior members of the community. In the first of these incidents, I and some of my friends were riding bicycles down a steep hill at the edge of the Tauber Valley. We didn't know that we were being watched by one of the forestry employees. When it came to my turn, I came down the hill at some speed and he threw a rock at the bike, knocking me off. He then proceeded to give me a quite uncalled for beating up. My parents were appalled by this violence towards me and decided to take him to court to answer for his behavior. It seemed that my mother and father were still naive about the working of the town and thought that the truth would suffice in court. There was only one solicitor available in Creglingen, and he jumped quickly to the defense of the forestry man. Therefore, we had to hire a solicitor in Bad Mergentheim to represent us. On the day our side of the story was told, we found that the defense had produced 3 witnesses from Creglingen who swore that I was a hooligan and a vandal, that I was constantly wild about the town and leading the other, more sensible children astray. The judge at Bad Mergentheim, where the Amtsgericht was, looked at the weight of evidence and decided that the forestry man was vindicated and that my parents would have to publish an apology in the local paper. All in all, the experience cost us a lot of money, and there was no way that we could repeat the action if I was attacked again. Outside this incident, many other, more subtle tactics were adopted by these vindictive people. This was to make my life very stressful for a time until things came to a head. I was aware that the attitude of my parents was becoming more and more severe towards me. They had become very strict and punished me harshly for the most minor transgressions. I began to become very unhappy and confused. I really didn't know what I was doing wrong. Of course, at that age you still believe that your parents are infallible and therefore you have no choice but to internalize the stress. The only conclusion is that you, yourself, are wrong and perhaps bad on the inside. Things got worse and worse until one day, when my mother was supervising my piano lessons, she began to beat me for the most minor mistakes. In the end, she took off her shoe and took that to me as well. That was enough for me, and I ran from the room to my bedroom, locking the door. I opened the window and threatened to jump out if anyone tried to open the door. I was so unhappy and confused that I think I would have actually done it. This shocked my parents into reviewing the situation, and they told me that they had been in receipt of a constant stream of complaints about my conduct and behavior about town. When we discussed this in detail, it became apparent that the accusations were, for the most part, unfounded. I was no angel. I was a normal, healthy boy, and naturally I got into trouble from time to time. But the story which had reached my parents showed a picture of a really bad boy dragging their reputation and standing within the community through the mud. They had believed the tales and had become unnecessarily aggressive towards me. Once we had discussed the matter, their behavior changed towards me and I felt much better. I think that this was probably their first occasion when I had a serious and adult exchange of views with my parents. And with these stories from living in small town southern Germany in the 1920s, we are at the end of this episode. As you've learned, at the time the standard of living was quite different from today. It's been about 100 years, and back then it was common to have an outhouse instead of central plumbing, and electricity in every town or village was still far away. It's hard to imagine how far we've come in this time frame, but it's also interesting to note Ulrich's remarks about local dialects. I can tell you from my own experience that depending on where you are, there are still German dialects around that are completely incomprehensible to even German native speakers. When I started my service in the army, my basic training took place in a very small town in the southeast of Bavaria, and I kid you not, during the first 2 weeks I could only understand half of what was spoken. Generally speaking, the smaller the town, the more severe the dialect. Now, both Swabian and Frankian are very distinct dialects, and to me personally they both sound rather hilarious, but I can see how a child will receive ridicule after moving from one area to the other. As Ulrich said, and as most of you surely know, kids are ruthless when it comes to such things. What also hasn't changed are small-town politics. For my American friends, this is probably something you can relate to. Suffice to say, back then the social consequences for newcomers or outsiders were rather serious. We have also learned about Ulrich's propensity for all things mechanical, which is something I can personally really relate to. The picture I've put up is yours truly at the age of about 2, and I am playing with, or rather rearranging, the model train set of my older brother. As you can imagine, he wasn't really pleased by my doing so, since he built the entire diorama himself and had to do it all over again afterwards. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this spotlight on rural Germany in the 1920s, and I will see you again next time. Cheers.